You keep telling yourself a story, and it's killing you slowly, quietly, almost politely. The kind of lie that doesn't scream, it whispers. You just need one big break, one big change, one moment that flips everything. But listen to me, look at me. You don't need a breakthrough. You need to stop breaking your own discipline in 1,000 invisible places every single day. You think your life is heavy because of what happened to you, but the truth is far colder than that. Your life feels heavy because of what you repeatedly allow. Every ignored alarm, every promise you made to yourself, and quietly betrayed when no one was watching. That's where the weight comes from. Not trauma, not bad luck, not the world. It comes from you, choosing the easier version of yourself over and over again, until that version becomes permanent. And I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to confront you, because deep down, you already know this. You feel it when you wake up and hit snooze like it's a reflex, like you've trained yourself to delay your own life. You feel it when your hand reaches for your phone before your mind even wakes up, scrolling through other people's lives while yours stands still. You feel it in that quiet moment at night when everything slows down and there's nowhere left to hide. And you realize you didn't move forward today. Not really. You just stayed busy, distracted, occupied, but not improved. And that's the trap. You've confused motion with progress. You've convinced yourself that being tired means you're doing enough. But exhaustion is not proof of growth. Sometimes it's proof of misdirection. You are not stuck because life is unfair. You are stuck because your habits are perfectly designed to keep you exactly where you are. Read that again. Not once, not twice, until it burns. Your habits are not random. They are a system. A system that is either building you or quietly destroying you. And right now, whether you admit it or not, your system is working against you. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that alarms you. That's what makes it dangerous. It's subtle, it's quiet, it's consistent. You don't fall apart in one day. You drift. One decision at a time, one compromise at a time, one it doesn't matter at a time, until one day it does matter. And by then, the gap between who you are and who you could have been feels impossible to close. But here's the part that should shake you. The same force that is pulling you down can build you up. The same consistency that is slowly weakening you can make you unstoppable. The problem is not that you're incapable. The problem is that you've been consistent in the wrong direction. You've trained yourself to choose comfort over growth so many times that it feels natural now, automatic. Like you don't even think about it anymore. And that's the real danger. Not failure, but automation. Because once something becomes a habit, it no longer needs your permission. It runs on its own. And right now, your life is being run by habits you didn't consciously choose, but repeatedly reinforced. You didn't wake up one day and decide to be undisciplined. You became that way through repetition. Quiet, invisible repetition. And that means something powerful. It means you can reverse it the same way. But don't get excited yet, because this is where most people fail. They hear the truth, they feel the spark, and then they go right back to their old patterns. Why? Because they're addicted to intensity, not consistency. They want to feel powerful for a moment instead of becoming powerful over time. They want a surge of motivation instead of a system of execution. And when that feeling fades, as it always does, they collapse. Not because they're weak, but because they never built anything stable. You've done this before, haven't you? You told yourself, this is it. This time I'm serious. You made a plan. You felt the energy. You started strong, and then slowly you disappeared. Not all at once, not dramatically, just less effort, less focus, less discipline, until you were right back where you started, wondering what went wrong. I'll tell you what went wrong. You tried to change your life in one leap instead of changing it one step at a time. You tried to become a different person overnight, instead of earning that identity through repeated action. And life doesn't work like that. Reality doesn't reward bursts, it rewards patterns. What you do occasionally means nothing. What you do repeatedly defines everything. And right now, your repetition is your prison. But it can also be your weapon, if you decide, truly decide, to take control of it. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, now. Because readiness is a lie. You will never feel ready to become someone stronger than you are today. You become ready by acting before you feel like it, by moving when every part of you wants to stay still, by choosing discipline in moments where no one would blame you for choosing comfort. That's where change begins, not in big moments, but in small, quiet decisions that no one sees, but that shape everything. And this is the part where you need to be brutally honest with yourself. Not about what you want, but about what you do. Because your actions are your truth. Not your intentions, not your plans, not your excuses. Your actions. And if your actions don't align with the life you say you want, then you don't want it badly enough. That's the reality. Harsh, uncomfortable, but necessary. Because once you accept that, once you stop blaming the world, your past, your circumstances, you take your power back, completely. Because now, the same mechanism that's been holding you back becomes the exact mechanism that will push you forward. And it starts with something so small, so simple, most people overlook it, but you won't. Not anymore. Because now you see it for what it really is, the beginning of everything. You underestimate it. That's your first mistake. You look at 1% and your mind immediately dismisses it as insignificant, harmless, too small to matter. And that right there is why it controls your entire life without you even realizing it. Because anything you consider too small, you stop paying attention to. And anything you stop paying attention to starts running in the background, unchecked, unchallenged, unquestioned. And that's exactly how your habits have taken over you. Not through force, but through invisibility. Through repetition so subtle you never sounded the alarm. And now you're living inside the result of thousands of 1% decisions stacked on top of each other, compressed into what you call your current reality. You keep searching for massive change, dramatic transformation, a moment where everything flips and suddenly you're different, stronger, disciplined. But reality doesn't operate in explosions. It operates in accumulation, in quiet, compounding forces that don't announce themselves until it's too late to ignore them. And the 1% rule is the purest form of that truth. It is not loud. It does not impress you instantly. It does not give you a dopamine hit. It builds, slowly, relentlessly, mercilessly, whether you like it or not. 1% better today means almost nothing in isolation. You read one page, you do one extra rep, you choose water over sugar, you go to bed 10 minutes earlier, and your brain says, this doesn't change anything. Because your brain is addicted to immediate results, addicted to visible outcomes, addicted to proof. But growth doesn't give you proof up front. It demands trust in the process before it rewards you with results. And that's where most people quit, because they cannot tolerate the phase where effort feels disconnected from outcome. But listen carefully. The 1% rule is not about what happens today. It's about what happens when today repeats, and repeats, and repeats again until it becomes a trajectory. And once you're on a trajectory, you're no longer deciding your future consciously. It's being calculated automatically, based on your direction. Imagine two versions of you, one improving 1% every day, the other declining 1% every day. At the start, they look identical. Same energy, same mindset, same potential. You wouldn't even notice the difference in a week, maybe not even a month, because the change is microscopic, almost invisible. But time is not neutral. Time amplifies direction. And as days stack into weeks and weeks into months, that tiny 1% begins to stretch into a gap, a noticeable one, then a painful one, then an irreversible one. The version that improved is now sharper, faster, more disciplined, more confident, not because of one big moment, but because of thousands of small votes cast in favor of growth, while the other version, the one that declined, is now slower, weaker, more distracted, more uncertain. Again, not because of one catastrophic failure, but because of repeated neglect, repeated compromise, repeated surrender to comfort. And here's the part that should hit you hard. Both outcomes feel natural to the person living them, because neither version notices the change as it's happening. It's too gradual, too smooth, too quiet, until one day the results become undeniable. And by then, the gap is no longer easy to close. That's the brutality of compounding. It doesn't warn you, it doesn't negotiate, it simply reflects your consistency back at you in amplified form. You don't get what you want, you get what you repeat. And right now, whether you admit it or not, you are repeating patterns that are either building you or eroding you. There is no neutral ground, no pause button, no, I'll just stay the same. Staying the same is an illusion, Because if you are not intentionally improving, you are unintentionally declining. The world moves. Time moves. Your mind adapts. And without conscious direction, it drifts toward ease, toward comfort, toward the path of least resistance, which is always downward. That's why 1% worse is so dangerous. Because it feels like nothing. It feels like rest, like harmless indulgence, like, I deserve this, like, it's just today, like, I'll start tomorrow. And each time you say that, you reinforce the pattern. You strengthen the identity of someone who delays, someone who negotiates with their own goals, someone who chooses immediate relief over long-term strength. And identity, once formed, becomes self-perpetuating. You don't act based on what you want. You act based on who you believe you are. And if your daily actions keep voting for a weaker version of yourself, that's the version that wins every time. But here's where the shift happens. And you need to feel this, not just understand it intellectually. 1% better is not about the action itself. It's about the identity it reinforces. When you choose discipline in a small moment, you are not just completing a task. You are sending a signal to your brain. This is who I am now. And that signal, repeated daily, becomes belief. And belief becomes behavior. And behavior becomes reality. That's the loop. That's the system. And once you understand that, you stop chasing big wins. You stop obsessing over massive results. You stop waiting for motivation. Because you realize something deeper. You realize that every small action is a vote, and your life is the sum of those votes. You don't need to win the day in a spectacular way. You need to win it in a consistent way, in a controlled way, in a way that can be repeated even when you're tired, even when you're stressed, even when you don't feel like it. Because the power of the 1% rule is not in intensity, it's in sustainability. Anyone can go all out for a day, a week, even a month. But very few can maintain a small, disciplined action every single day without fail. And that's why very few people experience real transformation. Because real transformation is not exciting. It's repetitive. It's predictable. It's almost boring. And your ego hates that. Your ego wants to feel special, wants to feel like you're doing something extraordinary, something impressive. But extraordinary results come from ordinary actions repeated with extraordinary consistency. That's the trade. You give up the illusion of intensity, and you gain the reality of progress. And once you commit to that, truly commit, something shifts. You stop asking, does this matter? And you start asking, can I repeat this? Because repetition is the only currency that compounds. A single good decision means nothing if it's not followed by another, and another, and another, until it becomes automatic, until it no longer requires effort, until it becomes part of who you are. That's when the 1% rule reaches its full power, when it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. And at that point, you're no longer trying to change your life. Your life is changing itself, based on the system you've built, based on the direction you've locked in. So stop looking for big moves. Stop waiting for perfect conditions. Stop underestimating the small things. Because the small things are not small. They are everything. They are the foundation, the mechanism, the engine behind every result you admire. And whether you accept it or not, you are already living the 1% rule right now. The only question is, which direction are you compounding in? You keep telling yourself you've tried, that you've pushed, that you've wanted it badly, that you've made plans and taken action, and still somehow you end up in the same place, same cycle, same frustration. So you start to believe the problem is external, something missing, something unfair, something out of your control. But listen carefully, because this is where most people lie to themselves. You are not failing because you don't try. You are failing because your way of trying is broken at its core. You rely on motivation like it's a fuel source, like it's something stable, something you can summon on command, something that will carry you through resistance. But motivation is unstable, unpredictable, temporary. It spikes, it fades, it disappears exactly when you need it most. And every time it leaves, you collapse with it because you built your effort on something that was never designed to last. That's why you start strong and then slowly disappear, not because you're incapable, but because your system depends on a feeling, and feelings are unreliable. You wait to feel ready, you wait to feel inspired, you wait to feel disciplined, and in that waiting, you lose momentum, you lose consistency, you lose direction, and then you wonder why nothing sticks. There is no version of discipline that depends on emotion. Discipline begins exactly where emotion ends. And if you don't understand that, you will repeat this cycle forever, chasing temporary energy instead of building permanent structure. And here's the deeper problem. You don't actually fail in the moment you quit. You fail in the design of your approach long before you ever begin. You set expectations that are unrealistic. You try to change too much too fast. You overload your system with intensity, and for a short time, it works. You feel powerful. You feel in control. You feel like this time is different. But it's not different. It's just louder, and loud doesn't last. Because what you're really doing is forcing behavior that your identity hasn't earned yet. You're trying to act like someone you haven't become, and that creates friction, resistance, exhaustion, until eventually you snap back to your default patterns, the ones that feel natural, automatic, effortless, the ones you've reinforced for years. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your conditioning. And your conditioning right now is not aligned with the life you say you want. That's why you keep failing. Not because your goals are wrong, but because your identity and your habits are still tied to an older version of you. One that chooses comfort, one that avoids discomfort, one that negotiates with effort instead of committing to it. And habits are powerful in a way most people don't fully grasp. They are not just actions, they are programs, loops that run automatically, triggered by cues, reinforced by rewards, repeated until they become part of your neurological wiring. You don't think about them anymore. You don't question them, you just execute them. And that's why your bad habits are winning, because they don't rely on your willpower, they bypass it completely. While you sit there debating, hesitating, negotiating, your habits are already in motion, already deciding your behavior before you even become aware of it. That's the gap between intention and execution. And most people live their entire lives inside that gap, believing that wanting something is enough, believing that understanding something is enough. But understanding without repetition is useless. Intention without structure is powerless. You know what to do. You've known for a long time. Wake up earlier, train your body, focus your mind, eliminate distractions, build something meaningful. None of this is new information. None of this is a mystery. The problem is not knowledge. The problem is application. Consistent, structured, unavoidable application. And every time you fail to apply, every time you delay, every time you say, just this once, you reinforce the exact identity you're trying to escape. You become the person who doesn't follow through. You become the person who quits when it's uncomfortable. You become the person who chooses short-term relief over long-term growth. And once that identity is reinforced enough times, it becomes your default, your baseline, your automatic setting. And changing it feels almost impossible. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires you to break patterns that have been repeated thousands of times. And breaking patterns is uncomfortable. It creates friction, resistance, internal conflict, because you are literally trying to override a system that has been optimized for ease, for efficiency, for familiarity. Your brain doesn't care about your goals. It cares about energy conservation, about predictability, about survival. And your current habits, even if they are destructive, feel safe because they are known. So when you try to change, when you try to introduce discipline, structure, effort, your brain pushes back, not because it wants you to fail, but because it wants to protect what it recognizes as normal. And if you don't understand this, you will misinterpret that resistance as a sign that you're not capable, that something is wrong, that maybe this isn't for you, and you'll retreat, back into comfort, back into old patterns, back into the cycle. That's why you keep failing, not because you lack potential, but because you lack a system that accounts for resistance, a system that doesn't rely on feeling good, a system that makes execution automatic instead of optional. You treat discipline like a choice, something you can take or leave depending on your mood. But discipline is not a choice if you want change. It is a requirement, a non-negotiable standard that you follow regardless of how you feel. And until you internalize that, until you remove the option to negotiate, you will continue to fall back into inconsistency, into half-effort, into cycles of starting and stopping. You don't need more motivation. You need fewer decisions. Because every decision you leave open becomes a point of failure, a moment where you can choose the easier path, the familiar path, the path that keeps you exactly where you are. And right now, your life is full of those open decisions. Wake up or snooze, work or scroll, push or stop. And too often, you choose the path of least resistance. Not because you're weak, but because your system allows it. Because nothing is locking you into the harder choice. That's the flaw. That's the reason. You are trying to rely on willpower in an environment that constantly drains it, constantly distracts you, constantly pulls you away from what matters. And willpower alone is not enough. Not long-term, not consistently. You need structure. You need constraints. You need a system that reduces friction for the right actions and increases friction for the wrong ones. But instead, you keep relying on bursts of energy, on moments of clarity, on emotional spikes. And those moments fade, always. And when they do, you have nothing to fall back on. No structure, no system, no automatic behavior to carry you forward. So you stop. You reset. You promise to start again. And the cycle continues. And each time it continues, it becomes harder to break. Because you're not just reinforcing habits, you're reinforcing beliefs. Beliefs about yourself, about your ability, about what you're capable of sustaining. You start to see yourself as inconsistent, as someone who can't follow through, as someone who always falls short. And those beliefs shape your future actions, because you act in alignment with what you believe about yourself. That's why this is deeper than just habits. This is about identity. And right now, your identity is not aligned with your goals. And until it is, you will keep failing. Not because you don't want to succeed, but because your current identity cannot sustain the behaviors required for success. So understand this clearly. You are not broken. You are patterned. And patterns can be changed, but not through intensity, not through motivation, not through one big decision. They are changed through consistent, repeated action that gradually rewires your system, that slowly shifts your identity, that replaces old loops with new ones. But that only happens if you stop relying on the same broken approach. If you stop chasing feelings and start building structure. If you stop negotiating and start executing. If you stop trying to leap and start learning how to step. Consistently, relentlessly, without interruption. Because until you do that, nothing changes. You don't fix your life with a burst of motivation. You rebuild it with a system that doesn't ask you how you feel, that doesn't care whether you're tired, distracted, or doubting yourself. A system that runs anyway, because it has been designed to remove choice from the moments where you are weakest, because that's where your life has been slipping through your hands. Not when you're strong, but when you hesitate. So understand this clearly. You are not here to try harder. You are here to make it harder to fail. And that begins with structure, with designing your environment, your routines, your triggers, in a way that forces the right behavior to become the easiest behavior, the default behavior, the automatic response. You don't wake up and negotiate with yourself anymore. You wake up and execute, because the decision was already made the night before, the week before, the moment you committed to a system instead of a feeling. And it starts small, painfully small, because anything big will collapse under inconsistency. Anything too intense will burn you out before it rewires you. So you lower the barrier until it becomes impossible to refuse. One push-up, one page, 1 minute of focus. It sounds almost insulting. Good. Because your ego is not the one doing the work. Your system is. And your system only cares about one thing: repetition. You don't need to prove anything today. You need to repeat something today. Because repetition is what builds identity. Repetition is what carves new pathways into your brain until the action no longer feels like effort. It feels like who you are. And that's the shift you've been missing. You've been trying to act like a disciplined person without becoming one. Trying to force outcomes without building the process that produces them. So now you reverse it. You forget outcomes. You forget results. You forget timelines. You focus only on the system. Only on the actions you can repeat regardless of mood, regardless of circumstance. You create anchors in your day, fixed points that do not move, habits that are attached to existing routines so they piggyback on what already exists. Because starting from zero is fragile, but stacking onto something stable creates momentum. You wake up, you drink water, you move your body for 1 minute, not because it changes your physique instantly, but because it reinforces the identity of someone who acts, someone who moves, someone who does not delay. You sit down to work. You remove distractions before they become a choice. You block the noise. You create an environment where focus is not heroic, it is inevitable. Phone out of reach, notifications off, workspace clean. Because every distraction you leave available is a decision waiting to sabotage you, and you are done giving yourself unnecessary decisions. You reduce friction for the right actions. You increase friction for the wrong ones. If you want to read, you place the book where your hand naturally goes. If you want to train, you prepare your clothes before you sleep. If you want to stop scrolling, you make it harder to access. You create barriers. You remove the easy path to weakness. This is not about willpower. This is about design. Because willpower fades, but design remains. And once your environment supports your goals instead of fighting them, execution becomes lighter, smoother, more consistent. But don't confuse ease with comfort. The system is not comfortable. It is efficient. It removes unnecessary struggle so you can face the necessary struggle. The repetition, the showing up, the doing the same small action every single day without needing novelty, without needing excitement. And this is where most people break, because they get bored, because they crave intensity, because they want to feel like they're doing something big. But big is not what changes you. Consistent is. So you learn to respect the boring, to embrace the predictable, to understand that mastery is built in repetition, not in variation. You show up when it's easy, and you show up when it's hard, and you show up when it feels meaningless, because you trust the system more than your emotions. And every time you show up, you cast another vote, another confirmation, another reinforcement of the identity you are building. You don't skip because you're tired, you scale. You don't quit because you're overwhelmed, you simplify. The rule is simple. Never break the chain, never allow a 0 day, because 1 0 becomes 2, 2 becomes a pattern, and patterns define outcomes. So even on your worst day, you do the minimum, the smallest version of the habit, because the goal is not performance, the goal is continuity. You are protecting the identity, protecting the system, protecting the streak of consistency that is slowly transforming you beneath the surface. And over time, something changes. The resistance that once felt heavy starts to fade. The actions that once required effort start to feel automatic. The identity that once felt distant starts to feel real. You don't have to convince yourself anymore. You don't have to hype yourself up. You simply act, because that's what you do now. And that's when the system takes over. When it no longer depends on conscious effort, when it runs in the background, guiding your behavior without constant negotiation, that's when you become dangerous. Because now your progress is no longer fragile, no longer dependent on mood, no longer vulnerable to distraction. It is locked in, stable, inevitable. But understand this, the system only works if you respect it, if you protect it from disruption, if you treat your habits as non-negotiable standards, not optional tasks. You don't try to follow your system, you follow it. You don't debate with it, you execute it. Because every time you break it without reason, you weaken it. You send a signal that it's flexible, that it can be ignored, and once that signal is repeated, the system loses its power. So you become strict, not with intensity, but with consistency. You hold the line. Every day, every situation, every mood. And when you fail, because you will fail at some point, you don't collapse, you don't spiral, you don't turn one mistake into a pattern. You reset immediately. You return to the system without emotion, without drama, because the system is bigger than any single failure. You don't identify with the mistake. You identify with the process of correction. That's how you stay on track, not by being perfect, but by being consistent in returning to the path. And as this continues, day after day, week after week, the compound effect begins to show, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, then more clearly, more powerfully, until one day you realize that the person you used to be, the one who hesitated, who delayed, who negotiated, is no longer in control, because you replace that version, not with one big decision, but with thousands of small ones, executed through a system that you built, protected, and repeated until it became who you are. And that's the point. Not to rely on motivation, not to chase intensity, but to build something that runs even when you don't feel like it. Something that carries you forward when your mind tries to pull you back. Something that makes progress inevitable because it is embedded in your daily actions. That is how you build the system. not by dreaming bigger, but by executing smaller, again and again until small becomes powerful, until simple becomes unstoppable, until your life is no longer controlled by how you feel, but by what you do, consistently, without exception. You're waiting for a moment that doesn't exist, a loud, cinematic shift where everything clicks, where the pain disappears and discipline suddenly feels natural, where you wake up and say, "This is it, I've changed." But that moment is a fantasy, and the longer you wait for it, the longer you stay exactly where you are. Because real transformation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives in silence, built quietly through repetition, until one day the evidence is undeniable. And by then, it feels almost ordinary, almost expected, because you've already been living it without realizing it. That's how the 1% rule finishes its work. Not with a bang, but with inevitability. You don't notice the change while it's happening because your brain is wired to look for dramatic contrast, for sharp differences, for instant results. But compounding hides from that. It operates below your perception, below your need for validation. It accumulates beneath the surface while you question whether anything is working, while you doubt the process, while you feel like you're doing the same small actions with no visible reward. And that's the test, the real test. Not of your ability, but of your patience, your discipline, your willingness to continue without proof. Because anyone can act when results are obvious, but very few can continue when results are invisible. And that's why very few people reach the point where transformation becomes irreversible. You want to know when it happens. When you cross that line, it's not when you feel different. It's when your behavior no longer depends on your feelings, when you act without negotiation, without resistance, without internal debate, because the system has replaced the struggle. You wake up and you move, not because you're motivated, but because that's what you do. You sit down and you focus, not because you feel like it, but because that's your standard. You say no to distractions, not because you're forcing yourself, but because they no longer align with who you are. That's the shift. Identity has taken over, and once identity locks in, everything else follows. You don't chase discipline anymore. You embody it. You don't chase confidence. You generate it through action. You don't chase success. You create the conditions where success becomes the natural outcome of your behavior. And here's the part that most people misunderstand. When you reach this point, it doesn't feel extraordinary. It feels normal, because you've recalibrated your baseline. You've raised your standards so gradually, so consistently, that what used to feel hard now feels automatic. What used to require effort now requires nothing. And what used to be impossible now feels inevitable. That's the power of slow transformation. It doesn't just change your results, it changes your perception of what's normal. And once your definition of normal shifts, your entire life shifts with it, because you no longer accept the behaviors that once held you back. You no longer tolerate the patterns that once defined you. You no longer negotiate with the version of yourself that chooses comfort over growth. That version still exists. It will always exist. But it no longer has control, because you've built something stronger, something more consistent, something that overrides it automatically. And that's what makes you dangerous. Not intensity, not talent, not luck. Consistency. Relentless, controlled, disciplined consistency that compounds day after day without interruption. While others are waiting for the perfect moment, you are executing. While others are starting and stopping, you are continuing. While others are chasing motivation, you are relying on structure. And over time, that difference becomes massive. Not because you did anything extraordinary, but because you did the ordinary without fail. That's the part most people can't accept, that greatness is built on repetition, not inspiration, on discipline, not desire, on systems, not emotions. They want the outcome without the process, the reward without the repetition, the identity without the evidence. And life doesn't work like that. Life responds to what you do consistently, not what you wish for occasionally. So when you look at someone who has built something powerful, something stable, something impressive, you are not looking at a moment. You are looking at a pattern, a system executed over and over again until it produced something undeniable. And now, that's what you're building. Not a burst, not a phase, not a temporary spike of effort, but a pattern, a system, a direction that does not break. And once that direction is locked in, once your daily actions align with your long-term identity, success stops being a question of if and becomes a matter of when. That's inevitability, and that's what you're after, whether you've realized it or not. You don't want occasional wins. You want predictable progress. You don't want to rely on how you feel. You want to rely on what you've built. You don't want to hope things will change. You want to know they will, because your actions guarantee it. And that's exactly what the 1% rule gives you. Not excitement, not instant gratification, but certainty. The certainty that if you continue, if you repeat, if you protect the system you've built, the outcome will come, because it has no choice. It is the natural consequence of your behavior. So stop looking for signs. Stop asking if it's working. Stop measuring your progress by what you can see today. Measure it by what you repeat today, because repetition is the only signal that matters. Every time you show up, you are reinforcing the trajectory, strengthening the system, deepening the identity. And every time you don't, you are weakening it. It's that simple. Not easy, but simple. And once you accept that simplicity, once you commit to it fully, without negotiation, without exception, everything changes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but permanently. You become someone who executes, someone who follows through, someone who builds instead of waits. And that version of you doesn't need motivation, doesn't need external pressure, doesn't need validation, because it is self-sustaining, driven by a system that runs every single day. That's the end of the cycle. No more starting and stopping, no more inconsistency, no more dependence on emotion. Just action, repeated, controlled, inevitable action that compounds into results, into identity, into a life that reflects exactly what you've built. And when you reach that point, you don't look back with regret. You look back with clarity, because you finally understand. It was never about doing something big. It was about doing something small, every single day, until small became everything.